of the British Columbia Human Rights Commission. As such, she is responsible for ensuring the fair, effective, and efficient administration of the BC Human Rights Code. Prior to becoming the Chief Commissioner, MaryWoo was a Vice Chair of both the Human Rights Board of Inquiry and the Pay Equity Hearings Tribunal for the province of Ontario. While in Ontario, she also served as a member of the Civilian Commission on Police Services, was co-chair of the Minister of Citizenship's Anti-Racism Advisory Working Group, and was a community member of the Cabinet Roundtable on Anti-Racism. She was co-chair of the Committee on Gay and Lesbian Issues, a subcommittee of the Toronto Mayor's Committee on Community and Race Relations. She also co-chaired the Campaign for Equal Families, which fought for legislation to end discrimination against same-sex families and relationships. MaryWoo was the founding mother of the Women Against Violence Against Women Rape Crisis Centre in Vancouver. She was awarded the Chinese Canadian National Council's 1997 Chinese Canadian Pioneer Award. She has a broad range of experience in dealing with human rights issues, from the perspective of an activist trade unionist when she was a member of the Telecommunication Workers Union of BC, and as a manager when she managed human rights and employment equity on human rights cases. She brings all of these experiences to her position of Chief Commissioner for the Human Rights Commission. And so please, along with me, welcome MaryWoo Sims.
Thank you very much, Mo, for thinking about me and that glass of water, and it would be great sometime. But I first want to thank Marilyn James for those words of welcome and inspiring message to begin the conference for this weekend, and also to thank the Sinixt people for allowing us the use of their land to hold this conference. I'm always mindful as an immigrant to Canada, as we all are, that we should not forget the contributions and the sacrifices and the welcoming arms in which the First Nations of Canada have treated us with, and which we have historically so abysmally treated them in return. So I really want to sincerely thank Marilyn James for the words of welcome, and to the Sinixt people for allowing us to have this conference on their land. And please pass those messages back to her. I'm sorry, I would have loved to have met her, and we will have another opportunity, I'm sure. I'm very glad to be here this evening, and I'm unfortunately can't stay for the entire conference. I would love to have been able to do so, but I have been away quite often recently and will be going to Halifax on Monday, and so I decided that for family peace I would have to at least spend one day of the weekend at home before heading off again. I noticed that the conference brochure has me speaking about what's a woman like you doing in a job like this. And I remember that when Mo and I talked about the title of my speech, that I had said to her, gee, that's very similar to something that I was asked when I first wanted to get into non-traditional occupations about 20 years ago, except the question that was asked of me by a male hiring supervisor when I wanted to get into truck driving work was, what's a pretty little girl like you wanting to get her hands dirty in this kind of a job for? And that really kind of started me off on human rights work, along with other experiences that I had. And this conference is about confidence, competence, and community control. And certainly when I first got involved in human rights 20 years ago, that wasn't really a part of me. Until I got really mad about the ongoing unfairness that I was experiencing trying to get jobs in non-traditional occupations, and decided that I wasn't going to take it anymore and had to do something personally as well as for other women to become involved and to do something about it, because this just couldn't go on. And I also remembered the stories that my mother used to tell me about her experiences and how she was encouraging me to move beyond what she was allowed to by society at that time. My mother was born in Shanghai, and in those days, women were not valued, and there are still issues around women not being valued in certain countries. But she was not allowed to go to school because she was a girl, and girls don't need to go to school because they're just going to get married and look after the house. So she didn't have an opportunity to become educated, and she always said to her daughters, there were 4 of us and 2 boys in the family, she always encouraged the girls in the family to push the boundaries, to go further than she was allowed to go, and to never allow somebody to tell you where your boundaries are. It's one thing if you say to yourself, gee, I think I don't want to do that, like bungee jumping. I would never want to do bungee jumping, but at least I get to make the choice whether or not I bungee jump. But nobody's going to tell me that I can't do it. And that was something that was passed on to me by my mother, and I'm eternally grateful to her for doing that. I want to talk a little bit about why I think it's important for women to become organized and to become politically active, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about my own sort of experiences with that. But I think it's really important for us to think back into history about where we have come from, because I often find that when I'm talking particularly to young people, whether they're in high school or university, they only know now, and now's not that bad in their view. And they don't understand why people like us say things like, well, you have to remain ever vigilant. You know, you always have to keep on struggling to move forward. And they think that, well, we're there already, and why do we have to do this? And, you know, I don't ever want to be known as a feminist. I don't ever want to be known as a radical, and so on. And we have to talk about that. And share our experiences, and also talk about history and where we've come from to enable us to deal with the present, and also to know why we want a better future, and to have that conversation with younger people about why we need to work towards a better future. Now, the starting point in the struggle for women's equality in North America is commonly identified with the recognition of women as persons under the law. Until 1930, women were denied civic and political duties, including the right to vote, to hold public office, to own property, and to enter into legal relationships because they were not considered persons in the eyes of the law. The conventional wisdom of that time was that women were not legal persons and could not claim the rights associated with legal personhood because of their, quote, inferiority, I can't even say that word, of bodily ability and mental inferiority. For example, in justifying the exclusion of women from being able to hold public office, a judge at that time stated, this is a quote, such subjects are beyond their cognizance and inconsistent with the delicacy and modesty of their sex, end quote. The first challenges to the legal definition of person, which was limited to men, met with these same attitudes. In 1872, in the case of Bradwell versus Illinois, Myra Bradwell applied to be admitted to the practice of law. The rules regulating the legal profession at that time restricted the practice of law to licensed persons. The U.S. Supreme Court held that women were not persons, and so Ms. Bradwell's application was denied. The Supreme Court justified the exclusion of women from the practice of law for a variety of reasons, among them that, and I quote again, the natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. The court was also of the view that the proper place for women was to remain at home. In this regard, Mr. Justice Bradley noted, The constitution of the family organization, which is founded in the divine ordinance, as well as in the nature of things, indicates that the domestic sphere as that which belongs properly to the domain and functions of womanhood. The harmony of the family institution is repugnant to the idea of a woman adopting a distinct and independent career from that of her husband. Myra Bradwell's experience was not unique to the United States. In 1905 in Canada, Mabel French, a resident of New Brunswick, applied to be admitted to the bar in that province. The legislation in force provided that persons having the requisite qualifications were entitled to be lawyers. Despite the fact that Ms. French had successfully completed the required legal training and had satisfied the Law Society of her moral character, her application was rejected on the basis of her sex. The New Brunswick Court of Appeal held that women were not within the meaning of the term persons, and as a result rejected Ms. French's application. It was not until 1930 that women attained the status of legal persons in Canada as a result of what's well known now as the Persons Case. In 1928, 5 prominent Canadian women, Henrietta Muir Edwards, Nellie McClung, Louise McKinney, Emily Murphy, and Irene Parlby, asked the Supreme Court of Canada to rule on whether qualified persons in Section 24 of the British North America Act included members of both sexes so as to allow for women to run for the Senate. The court held that women were not persons. On appeal to the Privy Council in London, England, the Privy Council held that women were indeed persons and therefore eligible to become members of the Senate of Canada. It has been over 60, 70 years now since women were legally recognized as persons, but have the attitudes responsible for preventing women from claiming legal rights solely on the basis of their sex become a thing of their past? Unfortunately not. Every day, women face barriers to equality because of their gender. The stereotypes which create these barriers are in many respects no different than those which were used to justify the denial of civic and political rights to women that were in the decision before the courts in the Persons Case. The key difference between the discrimination suffered by women now as compared to then is that the obstacles to equality women encounter today are for the most part not a result of the legal system, although that's still in existence, but less so now, but are rather informal or based on custom. As A. Jager stated in the book Feminist Politics and Human Nature, an extremely significant form of customary discrimination consists in reluctance to appoint qualified women to certain jobs, particularly prestigious, well-paying, or supervisory positions, and in reluctance to allow women to gain necessary qualifications for those positions, perhaps by refusing them entrance into professional schools or other job training programs. Such discrimination begins in the nursery, where male and female infants are perceived and handled differently, and continues in the educational system, where boys are encouraged to train for prestigious, well-paying masculine occupations, while girls are channeled into preparing them for the lower-paying but more feminine service occupations. Women also suffer discrimination in obtaining credit to buy a house or to start a business, and they may have more difficulty than men in renting accommodation. I know that when I first came out of school and went to the telephone company to apply for a position, there were 3 job streams that were available. There was clerical, we all know what that means, the operator class, and then there was what was called plant, and that was warehousing and all of the work outside, primarily on the lines and on telephone equipment. And I was interested in getting into any field. I mean, I was desperate for a job. So I said, well, what about the plant? I can work in the warehouse. Oh no, that's not for women. You have two streams available to you. You can choose operator or you can choose the clerical stream. But what about the plant? No, 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 that's not for women, only men go there. Oh, okay, well, I thought at that time, I'll go for the operator position, get my foot in the door, and then see where that will lead me. Well, I lasted 3 months as an operator, and I'm just desperate to get out. So I tried to get into the plant, into the warehouse, but again, it was the same resistance. Oh no, those jobs are for men, you wouldn't like it there. Well, I haven't ever worked there, how would I know I wouldn't like it there? Well, no, but they're not for you, we don't think you're qualified. And I said, how qualified do you have to be to work in the warehouse? But no, that wasn't allowed. So I said, okay, well then I'll go into clerical. So I worked in clerical. And I became more adamant about getting a job in the plant side of things when I found out that those guys were making at least $5 more an hour than I was in the clerical field, and at least $7 more an hour than I would have had I stayed in the operator field. And that really got me mad. And luckily, I had a union and I had built up seniority so that the next time they tried to tell me, oh no, you can't do that, and you cannot get that job because it's only for men, I said, I don't care. I think that's sex discrimination. I think it was the first time that I said those words, even though instinctively, every time they said you couldn't get that job because only men get those jobs, that it was a form of sex discrimination. But I still, in some ways, couldn't believe that I was going to be denied a job just because of my gender. So I'd never said the words, that's sex discrimination, to my employer at the time, because first of all, I needed the job the first time I applied there. And secondly, I wasn't really aware of what my rights were. And it was only until after I had started working there and talked to my colleagues and talked to the union about what was going on that they said, you don't have to put up with that. And that I finally moved beyond the clerical field and into non-traditional work. But even there was a lot of resistance because the assumption was that as a woman in a non-traditional job, you were taking a job away from a man who really needed that work. And every day I had to face not all of my male colleagues. I must say that there were a lot of men who were extremely supportive and were very helpful in teaching me sort of the unwritten rules of the trade, how to lift without killing yourself, and how some of the easy ways to get the job done was performed. But there were also other men who just hated the fact. I mean, that's the only way that I can put it, just hated the fact that there was now a woman in their, amongst their midst, and there was a lot of sexual harassment and so on. But there's the assumption that I didn't need that job. And I had to keep saying on a daily basis, look, I've got a house, I've got rent to pay. How do you know I don't have kids? How do you know I'm not the only breadwinner in my family? You are making assumptions based on your own stereotypes and prejudices. And I kept going at that day after day. It got kind of tiring, but eventually the message sunk in. And I didn't receive that kind of treatment anymore. But, I had to assert my rights. I had to say, look, I know what my rights are, and you can't keep on treating me like that. But the reality is that while there are legal instruments, such as human rights legislation and Section 15 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that guarantee women freedom from discrimination and the right to equality, women continue to be the victims of discrimination and are impeded in our efforts to gain equality. The truth is that despite these protections, women in Canada remain a disadvantaged group. The following is a description of the experiences of inequality faced by women today, as stated by the women's advocacy group LEAF, which is the Legal Education and Action Fund. Widely acknowledged indices of second-class citizenship, which have led to the recognition that women are a disadvantaged group, include women's unequal pay, allocation to disrespected work, demeaned physical characteristics, targeting for rape, domestic battery, sexual abuse as children, and systemic sexual harassment, depersonalization, use in denigrating entertainment and forced prostitution. For women, these abuses occur in a historical context characterized by disenfranchisement, preclusion from property ownership, exclusion from public life, and a sex-based poverty and devaluation of women's contributions in all spheres of social life which continue to the present day. The experiences of women in British Columbia today confirms that discrimination continues to impact our lives. And I know that as I look around this room, there are women who know full well what I'm talking about. But I also know that there are women who are saying, and who have said to me, I don't understand why we have human rights protections, and I don't understand why you say these things about women's inequality. So there's a lot of education we have to do even within our own community. But I want to show you some statistics, share some statistics with those who are sort of disbelieving that discrimination against women still exists. In British Columbia, while women currently make up 45.1% of BC's labor force, up from 35% in 1981, a significant wage gap continues to exist between men and women working at comparable jobs. In fact, BC has the widest gender wage gap among provinces in Canada. In 1994, women working full-time in BC earned 69.5% of what their male counterparts earned. So in simpler terms, that sounds to me like for every $1 my male counterpart earns, women earn 69.5 cents, or 69.5 cents. Ironically, in contrast to women's lower incomes, they have heavier workloads when all of the work, economic value, paid and unpaid, is included. The total workload index for women in 1992 stood at 1.08, while men's workload index was 1. This 0.08 gap means that women work over half an hour more every day than men, 8.9 hours compared to 8.3 hours. More work, less pay. We have a long way to go before we get to equality. More statistics to share with the unbelievers. Approximately 70% of workers earning $10 or less per hour are women. At the same time, more than 30% of BC women with jobs work part-time, compared to about 10% of men. A growing number of women work part-time because they cannot find full-time employment, and I still don't know how many people I continue to meet who talk about women earning pin money, and that part-time jobs is what they want. I have not yet talked to a woman yet who has said to me, I'd prefer working 4 part-time jobs as opposed to 1 full-time job. Mothers, in 1994, 34% of all female part-time workers indicated they wanted full-time employment but could only find part-time work. Mothers employed full-time with children under the age of 6 spend an average of 5.4 hours a day on unpaid housework compared to 3.4 hours for their male counterparts. Finally, women in BC are highly concentrated in 3 occupations, with 57% of women in clerical, sales, and service, compared to 27% of men. I also want to talk a bit about something that I've heard about this issue of women and work. There seems to be a backlash, now more audible than in the past, that the reason for the family breakup is because women are working outside of the home now. and that they are not at home looking after the children, and it's all the fault of the feminist movement, because if the feminists hadn't said that there shouldn't be sex discrimination and women should have jobs, we'd find that everything would be back to the Leave It to Beaver family unit, as I call it. And I just want to talk a little bit about that, because I think it's very dangerous to keep thinking that, or even supporting that, or even finding a notion of truth in that. Because really what the fight about non-discrimination is to allow people to have the choice. I mean, I think women should have the ability to choose whether they want to stay at home and look after children or go to work. But the reality is that under current economic conditions, when women's work at home isn't valued, there is no pension plan that you can buy into unless you're able to afford an RRSP. I don't know how, as an unpaid homemaker. That the reality is that women have to work. And until such time as women's contribution in the home is equally recognized as their contribution at work, and they're paid equally for that work, I think it is unrealistic to expect that women are going to choose to want to stay at home, because the realities of life are such that both partners involved in a family relationship have to work. The other thing, too, is that in the Scandinavian countries, there is mandatory parental leave. Here in Canada, it's optional, and I don't know whether in collective agreements that you're working with that whether you have that option available. But the issue of mandatory parental leave also allows for fathers to stay at home with children, paid as well. And I think that's something that we ought to be thinking about as well in those particular family units. But I just get very sick and tired, frankly, of feminists and also gays and lesbians being blamed for all of the ills of the world, as are now seemingly the case. The family would have stayed intact had only the woman stayed at home and had only there not been gays and lesbians. It's not the case. There are a lot more reasons for why families break up, one of which is domestic violence. So I just wanted to share that thought with you. I'm now rambling on. It's another soapbox that I could continue on. But the issue of pay equity is something that is going to come up more and more now, particularly with, I understand, the Hospital Employees Union is raising that as an issue in contract negotiations. But it's a very important piece of the equality puzzle for women that we get pay equity. There is a provision in the Human Rights Code around equal pay, but it's not proactive, such as pay equity legislation, for example, in Ontario, mandated. In waging the fight against discrimination, it is imperative to keep one thing in mind: all women are not the same. Society is made up of individuals of diverse heritages, identities, and experiences. Women in society reflect that diversity. Women who belong to racial minorities, who are lesbians, who are disabled, or who live in poverty are victims of discrimination for characteristics other than their sex, but which is at the same time intertwined with their gender. Additionally, women's experiences of inequality differ depending on their race, class, age, religion, marital status, and so on. True equality cannot be realized unless we are sensitive to these differences. A recurring criticism of the feminist movement, and I'm glad to see that we're moving beyond that, is that there's a failure to acknowledge and reflect the equality concerns of minority, lesbian, disabled, and poor women, and First Nations women. The notion underlying feminism that all women share a common experience of gender oppression has primarily been constructive from the perspective of middle-class, white, heterosexual, able-bodied women. And as I said, I'm glad to see that that is changing, and we have to continue to make sure that we include all women in the fight for equality. Now, how does one go about achieving equality? This is a question which has engendered debate amongst feminist lawyers, legal scholars, and activists. Generally speaking, two paths to equality for women have been identified. The sameness approach is one of them. And this is also an approach that women have internalized. If I just become one of the guys, then harassment won't happen. If I just go along with what's going on and not make waves about it, then maybe eventually they'll stop. But there's also the other side which says, well, if you just be like one of the guys, then this wouldn't happen to you. And the reality is that women are not men. And I experienced the sameness approach to equality once when I was working in a cable yard. It was one of the non-traditional occupations that I've had the pleasure of working in. And one of the guys absolutely, again, could not stand that a woman had come into his domain and was working there. I don't understand how a woman working in an occupation that has traditionally been occupied by men somehow has to be perceived as demasculizing the person, but that seems to be how it's taken. Anyway, the harassment got to a point where I just couldn't take it anymore, and I was actually thinking of reporting the harassment to management, which as a shop steward at the time I felt conflicted about, but I just couldn't deal with it anymore. So I went to one of my male colleagues and I said, you've noticed what's been going on. What do you think I should do about it? And he said, yeah, I know what's been going on. If I were you, I'd just take him out back and thrash him. And I thought, well, I don't want to say this, but it's kind of typical. But yes, of course he'd say that if he were being subjected to harassment, the way in which he would have dealt with it was to go out and challenge that fellow to a fight. But that's, first of all, I'm physically disadvantaged. The fellow was 6'2" and certainly heavier than I was at the time. But but that wasn't my way of challenging the harassment either. So I finally went to the local president and said, this is what's been happening. I'm very conflicted about whether or not I should go to management. Can you help me? And luckily, he was very, very sympathetic. And he went to the fellow and said, you've got to stop, because she has every right to complain about harassment, and if she does and management comes down hard on you, the union is not going to help you. And the harassment did stop. I mean, he was still not talking to me and didn't talk to me the rest of the time I was there, but at least I wasn't being subjected to pornographic pictures every time I came into work, or also physical threats that I was subjected to. But the sameness approach is, if they only accept me as one of the guys, then everything would change. And we now know that that doesn't work, because you're never going to be one of the guys. The other approach, of course, is to look at equality that you're equal but different. And that is the better approach. I mean, we are indeed all equal, but we also have differences that have to be acknowledged and also have to be accommodated. What can women do, both as individuals and together, to achieve equality? I believe that the answer to this question lies in one word, which is empowerment. And how do you become empowered? It's not that somebody sort of hands you something or taps you on the shoulder and says, you're now empowered. It doesn't work that way. I call it, when empowerment happens, I really think that what people do is reach a level where they say, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And I'm going to find a way of responding and reacting to something that I don't think is fair and that should change. And so I really would like to encourage you to become active and to empower yourselves to take action against inequality, because it's only when individuals such as yourselves take responsibility and take action that we can actually make change. I'm not going to be able to do it alone as Chief Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission, and neither is the entire Commission, or neither is just the Women's Ministry of Equality doing it by themselves. We have to work together to do that. And we have to support each other when we're doing that, and find ways of working with each other to enable that to happen. Now, involvement can take many forms. You can get involved in your unions if you're in unions, become involved in politics, become involved in any kind of political activity, become involved in school boards, become involved in your community in some way to deal with what's going on. And you may think, well, what can I do as an individual to move equality forward? I'm just one person in the Kootenays, wherever you come from. And to paraphrase Margaret Mead, she said, never doubt that an individual or a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever does. Finally, I would remind you again that women come from a variety of backgrounds, and that, as Angela Davis once put it, the process of empowerment cannot be simplistically defined in accordance with our own particular class interests. We must learn to lift as we climb. We must remain vigilant in our efforts to achieve equality for women. We must continue to move forward, because without vigilance on all our parts, there is a very real danger that we will lose the gains that women before us have struggled diligently to attain on our behalf. And furthermore, we must remain vigilant if we are to leave a legacy of equality for our children, and especially our daughters. Thank you very much.